Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this week's lesson, I'll tell you about discovered checks. I think I mentioned it briefly in some of the previous lessons, but I'd like to tell you in a bit more detail about it and how the different pieces can do discovered checks and things to pay attention to that can be important when it comes to discoveries. Well, let's get started right away. And here is our very first position for the team. Discovered checks that have a point or a goal to win something usually involve at least 4 pieces. It involves a piece that will move. It involves a second piece of the same color that's behind it, and by moving that first piece, the piece from behind will be giving a check to the enemy king. And in addition, there is a fourth piece that the piece that moves will attack. Let's see how all of this works out. So in this position, the key pieces, the key participants are the rook that's behind the piece that's about to move. And then on the other side, for black, there is a king, and there are a number of other pieces, but in this case, the important one is the queen. So let's see how all these pieces are important and what's the connection between them. When we make a discovered check, in this case with our bishop, for example, moving to d5, what happens is the piece behind the rook all of a sudden gets opened up and is giving a check to the king. The reason why this is unique is because normally when we move a piece, that very piece is the one that creates an attack. In this case, it's not that piece, but a different piece. The one whose file or rank or diagonal in some cases gets opened up. However, there are differences between discovered checks and discovered checks. In this case, all white did was give a check with all reality. It doesn't do much because black can simply move out of the check and then, so to say, nothing happened. However, the beauty of good discovered checks is that we are able to put our pieces on squares where normally we could not. In this case, the good move, the key move is moving the bishop to f5. Now here, if you purely look at the bishop, it seems that it could be captured either by the pawn or by the queen. And this is when the fact that we gave a discovered check comes in. And we realize that because the black king is under attack right now, black does not have the time to capture that bishop on f5. Black is forced to move his king out of the attack, and then white can and should capture the black queen on h3. As we saw in this variation, black was helpless, didn't have time to save the queen on h3. Let's move on to another example when we'll see the knight being the hero instead of the bishop, as we saw in this position. Here we go. In this position, similarly to the previous one, there are 4 pieces that are important to the equation. The only different one is the knight instead of the bishop in the previous example. Again, we see, besides the knight being important, a rook, and on the other side, a king and a queen. Again, if the knight just would make a discovered check, moving it to some random place like f5, the black king would simply move out to a safe square, to a free square, and the game would go on. White would not gain any advantage with our reality from the given discovery. On the other hand, thanks to the discovered check, the white knight is able to go to a normally unsafe square, go to b5 that seems to be controlled by the black pawn on c6. However, because at the same time the black king is under direct attack, black needs to react to that check, and after the king moves out, white can simply capture the queen. Again, white gained major material, gained a whole queen. Let's move on and see a different example when the piece behind is the bishop, the moving piece is the rook, and then of course black also has the king that will be getting a discovered check, and there is also a black queen that, as a matter of fact, is about to give checkmate to white. So white certainly does not have the time just to make a quiet move or a non-forceful move. Again, similarly to previous examples, while white has a good number of discovered checks, moving the rook anywhere in fact would be a discovered check. However, there is only one good one that at the same time that gives a discovered check also will attack the black queen and not leaving black the time to save both the queen and get out of the check. And that move is moving the rook to a4. Again, just like in the previous two examples, the rook moved to a square that normally would be unsafe because the black queen could capture it. However, not here, because we gave a discovered check. Black needs to react to that, needs to move the king, and then the white rook will capture the black queen. And let's move on to the next example, where we realize that even a small pawn can become a hero. It is also a perfect example to show never to give up hope, especially at beginner level. It's typically worth to play almost till checkmate, if not all the way to checkmate. This is an example when black has major material advantage. In fact, if it was black's turn, black could move his queen to a3 on his next move, and then checkmate white by moving the queen to b2. However, even when you're much behind in material, you can try to set up traps, and you should. In this case, black was careless and allowed white's discovered check by moving the little pawn up to e5, which seems like giving a pawn up, which is true. However, after the black king captures that pawn, white is gaining major material, is gaining black's queen. It's a good lesson never to be careless and always look out for your opportunities. And let's move on to the next example, and it will show you that surprisingly, even the king can be an important piece for an attack. In this case, besides the two kings, each side has a rook, and that's it. In most positions, unless you are able to capture or win the rook of the other side, the game is pretty much an automatic draw. However, this is one of those situations when white is able to win black's rook in just two moves. And the first move of that combination is a very important one, and it is a discovered check. Again, just like in the other examples, there are four participants. There is a piece behind. that is the piece that's about to move and create the discovery and to attack an enemy piece at the same time. And the move is king to e3. As we can see, black all of a sudden is in a check, and at the same time the black rook is under attack, and black is helpless to save his rook. After all the examples, we saw an example of each moving our different pieces, creating discovered checks. Let's see some examples that get a bit more complex, a bit more tricky. In this position, we have an endgame of rook and bishops with equal number of pawns. Most of the times, endgames like that tend to end in a draw, unless one side is either able to win material, one of your opponent's pieces like bishop or rook, or one of the pawns get to be promoted into a queen. In the current position, black has just moved his bishop to e3, attacking white's rook on c1. The bishop is about to take the rook, and that's a very important element to recognize. Because if in this position, white would think that by giving a discovered check with bishop d4, black would be forced to react to the check by moving the king, that would be an error. In our reality, black instead is able to capture white's rook, and with that, defend against the check, and of course, stay much ahead, winning an entire whole rook. So what should white do? Does white need to move the rook to get away from the threat? Well, that would certainly be too slow and would give black the opportunity to move out of a discovery. Instead, what white needs to do is give a discovered check in a way which at the same time protects the rook. And that tricky move in this case is moving the bishop back to d2. Now, white has interposed, blocked the threat of the black bishop to the white rook, yet created a discovery, a discovered check to black's king, and, just as importantly, attacked the black bishop at the same time. And now black cannot save his bishop. Let's move on to the next example that's slightly different, and we'll have to be cautious of a different situation. If here white would try the very same idea, moving the bishop to d2, giving a discovered check, and attacking the black bishop on f4, that would give black the opportunity to all of a sudden retreat the bishop and block the check at the same time. And black would be home safe. White needs to look for a different, better option to try to win the black bishop with a discovery. The good news is, and the difference from the previous example, that here the white rook is not being attacked. Therefore, white can safely give the check from e5, which obviously does not allow the black bishop's retreat to c7, as in the previous example. And now, after black moves out of the check, white would simply capture the black bishop and stay a bishop ahead. Let's move on to our next example, where white seems to have two ways to create a discovery which at the same time attacks the black queen. Only one of them achieves the desired goal. The question is, which one is wrong? Is knight f4 wrong, or is knight to c3 wrong? The correct answer is knight f4 would be a major mistake, because then the black king is able to get out of the check by at the same time capturing the white knight, which was attacking the black queen. Therefore, the correct solution is moving the knight to c3 rather. And now, after black moves out of the check, the black queen is helpless. Let's see a similar position, but instead of white's knight being on d5, we have a white bishop there. And again, white needs to be careful. Try to figure out what's the trick. Why only one of the two bishop moves that would attack the black queen works. Here, attacking the black queen from f3 would be a major mistake, because not only that black would not lose his queen, it would be white who would lose his rook. Therefore, the correct solution is moving the bishop to c4, making sure the rook is safe at the same time, while white creates the discovery. And let's move on to our next example, where it's clear again that white has a number of discovered checks. Generally speaking, when we have an option to give a discovery and at the same time attack various pieces of our opponent, we typically want to attack the most valuable one. Like, for example, if you can attack a queen and a rook, you'd want to give a discovery by attacking the queen. Or if your opponent has a rook and knight, you'd want to pick the rook to attack. However, in this case, that's not the right solution. Why? Because if the rook would move, for example, to d3, giving a discovered check, and attack the black rook at the same time, then black would simply get out of the check, and you'd have to realize that after rook takes rook, black would simply recapture and avoid losing a rook. What happened was, white simply traded rooks. It did not result in a gain of material. Instead, white needs to settle for winning a knight. And yet, white needs to be still careful from where to attack that knight. Should white attack the knight from d7, or should white attack the knight from b5? Or is it just the same? In most cases in chess, it's not the same, and you have to be careful and look out for the differences between the similar choices. Rook to d7 would be a major error, because black could capture the check-giving piece and moreover protect the black knight on b7 at the same time. The correct check is move the rook to b5 and create a discovery, and then only capture the black knight. To avoid losing a bit less material, black may give up his rook for the bishop, but nevertheless, at the end of the day, white has won 2 points, a rook and giving up only a bishop. Now let's see some situations where white uses discovered check to in fact end the game by checkmate. Here we are in this position. It looks like a critical position because black is the one who is about to give checkmate with queen to g2. Capturing the black knight with a check even doesn't do much good, because the black king could also capture white's bishop, and at best white can give a lot of checks and maybe draw the game. But white could not win. On the other hand, if white would find the correct move here, white can give checkmate in just 2 moves. And that correct sequence is moving the bishop to f5, which is a discovered check. Of course, if black blocks the check, white simply captures that, giving checkmate. Or after king g8, the bishop appears from e6 and gives checkmate. Let's move on to another example where white is actually giving checkmate in just one move using a discovery. In this position, it's black who has the material advantage. Nevertheless, white giving the right discovery is giving checkmate. Any of the bishop moves would result in a discovered check, but only one of them was good. And moving the bishop to where we did right now to c5 wouldn't be the right one because it would release the control of the g7 square and the black king would escape. However, after finding the correct one, moving the bishop to h6, the bishop would still control the g7 square and therefore black would be in checkmate. It's important to realize that moving the bishop to g7 itself would be an error because the black king could capture it. Let's move on to our next example where black is the one in check. And it's a very good example that just because your opponent gives you a check, it doesn't mean that you should be touching your king. You should look around that besides moving your king, what other options you may have. Perhaps you can capture the piece that's giving the check, or you may be able to block the check in a favorable way to you. In this case, not only that black can block the check successfully, but indeed can give a checkmate while doing that. This is an ultimate example of counterattack. Black, by retreating the bishop and blocking white's check, all of a sudden created a discovery to the white king, and that resulted in checkmate. And let's go back now to some further positions where one side uses a discovered check to win material. Let's see some examples when there are a lot of pieces on the board, which is of course very typical when these situations happen. Here again it's quite clear the participants of the discovery, the white rook, the white bishop, and the black king. And then white needs to look around and find the most valuable piece that the white bishop on e2 is able to attack. Naturally, if there is a queen and it's on the same color square as the bishop, that should be the target. And therefore, the correct move is moving the bishop to b5, where normally speaking it would be on an unprotected square, but here of course it's not the case, or it's not relevant, because at the same time the black king is also attacked, is in check, and therefore black cannot avoid losing material. Let's move on to our next example, where we'll see how even pawn promotion can be used for a discovery. It seems that black's bishop and knight ideally control the promotion square. Yet, black would have a sad awakening, realizing that after the pawn advances, at the same time it has opened up the 7th rank and created a discovered check, not giving black the time to capture white's newly promoted pawn. And let's see one of the most famous games regarding discovered checks to win material. White plays e4, black responds with e5, knight f3, and black plays the Petrov defense. White captures the pawn, black makes the first mistake by capturing white's pawn. White plays queen e2, attacking the black knight, the black knight retreats, and here we are. Voila! The white knight can move to a square that's protected threefold by black. Nevertheless, the knight cannot be captured because the black king is in check. Black cannot avoid losing material. And finally, an example from my own practice, a game that I played a long time ago in 1984. In this position, I used a cute little combination to win material, thanks to a discovery. I captured my opponent's knight, which seems to be solidly defended by my opponent's queen. However, after the bishop check, the white king needs to react to that, and after rook takes queen, black just won a piece. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned quite a bit about discovered checks, and we'll learn more about discovery next week. So long until then, and try to use discovered checks in your games in the meantime. Bye-bye.